Welcome to another episode of Conversations with Coleman. My guest today is John Wood Jr. John is a national leader at Braver Angels, which is a grassroots organization dedicated to the work of political depolarization. He's also a writer for USA Today. He's a former vice chairman of the Republican Party of LA County and a former nominee for Congress. John and I talk about 2020 and the legacy of BLM. We talk about the emotional and psychological pull of wokeness. We talk about the status of the American dream. I talk about my experience as a kid switching from public school to private school. We talk about the cultural barriers to success for Black and Hispanic kids. We talk about the similarities between original sin and white privilege, and much more. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you do too. So without further ado, John Wood Jr. Okay, John Wood Jr. Thanks for coming on my show, man.
Oh yeah, well it's a pleasure. Am I on your show or are you on my show?
Maybe both.
Maybe both.
We'll have to.
Maybe
yeah,
both.
we'll see.
Yeah. Well, this will be a joint hosting in both directions.
Yeah. So we were just talking about the last time we saw each other was early 2020 at the 1776 project with Glenn Lowry and Bob Woodson. Where
Will Riley and
Will Riley.
I think Carol Swain would have been there.
Swain, and we were all joined around a rebuttal of the 1619 project. And trying to take part in a narrative that was less steeped in grievance and attributing everything, all modern ills to the legacy of slavery. And so I hadn't thought about that in a while, and it occurs to me it's been 3 years. It doesn't seem like it's been that long.
Yeah, no, it's remarkable. And of course, the world turned upside down about 3 or 4 times in that space of time. And, many overlapping circumstances and calamities and catastrophes. I mean, we had the pandemic itself. We had, of course, the killing or murder of George Floyd. We had the summer of protests, following that. I think that must have been, the greatest degree of sort of, chaos in our streets, at least since the assassination of Dr. King in 68. We had the 2020 election, of course, which was wild just in and of itself. But then we had the whole sort of, voter fraud claim, the stolen election movement, and all that culminating in January 6th, and then the second impeachment of President Trump. And now, 3 years later, it looks like America's ready to do it all again, more or less, at least as far as the Trump-Biden rematch is concerned, and, maybe some surrounding things. Man, but what are your feelings about the last 3 years, since last time we saw each other?
Yeah, I mean, 2020 was a big year for me. And the more it recedes into the rear view mirror, the more I feel some people want to forget about it. And I want to remember it because it was the single greatest year-over-year increase in the homicide rate in the past 100 years, according to Pew. And that didn't happen in Canada, the UK, didn't happen in any of our Western European peer countries or Australia. It only happened here, so it wasn't the pandemic. People want to sweep under the rug the fact that all of the anti-police rhetoric and policies led to an increase in violent crime that was almost entirely experienced by the Black community.
Right.
That homicide spike was not shared across all communities equally. It was fairly concentrated. And it feels like someone asked me recently what I feel about BLM. And I listed some of the positive things BLM had done. For instance, almost no police ever got held accountable for almost anything. Before BLM, whether they killed a Black kid or a white kid, or police just did not get punished. And now police do sometimes get punished. So that I put in the win column. But in the loss column is the greatest spike in homicide experienced by the Black community possibly ever.
in terms of year over year increase. Your average person that supported the general vibe of the BLM moment does not know that.
Yeah.
And hasn't been made to account for that. So that's something I think about quite a lot.
Yeah, right. Well, let's pull on that thread a little bit, because you're doing something I think many people who at least don't follow you closely would not expect you to do, which is to point to some actual tangible good that came out of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And yet, of course, pointing to the larger fact that, on balance, a movement that was about saving Black lives, when you sort of connect it to perhaps the defund police movement, the spike in homicides that you were pointing to during that period of time, you can say is sort of, led to the loss of Black lives at some level of scale in a way that's tragic and heartbreaking and ironic. Here's my sentiment. I feel as you do, that ultimately the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of anti-racism activism in general has counterproductive consequences in a number of ways. I think that there's a deep appeal, emotional appeal, to Black Lives Matter, to movements for racial justice, because so many people in America, be they people of color or not, do feel that in some serious way, the legacy of racial persecution endures in American society. And, we can get into sort of critical frameworks for, how we define white supremacy in society and so forth, and our institutions calibrated towards the, oppression of African Americans. But this sense that there's deep racial injustice in America that persists to the present moment, it's a funny thing, because I feel like it requires deep parsing, but there's a raw emotion there that I actually find myself becoming more and more sympathetic towards in this sense. On the one hand, and you and I have talked along these lines in the past, but of course, time continues to move, and we continue to sort of develop in our understanding of things. I've always said, if you're judging the Black experience by me, there's very little to complain about. American society has been very good to me. I mean, I grew up in an integrated community, in a community where I was more or less celebrated for the color of my skin, and sort of liberal, progressive multiculturalism of Culver City, California, where we are now, as a matter of fact. I'm one of these people who I think benefited from the mainstream integration of African Americans into mainstream institutional life post-civil rights movement, But, I've put this basic sort of narrative to, friends of ours, including, of course, Professor Lowry and other folks. But I feel like, you look at the broad sweep of American history for a grossly sort of disproportionately large segment of the Black community, and you can simplify it by sort of going from slavery to sort of, Jim Crow terrorism in the absence of education and broad-based economic opportunities. You can look at, policies of residential segregation, which went from the federal government to local law enforcement to, real estate firms and so forth. You go into the harrowing sort of drama of the civil rights movement, a la 1950s and 1960s, and you can note tangible gains, of course. But then, and those tangible gains, I think, made the American experience as I know it possible for me and millions of other African Americans, right? But, one thinks about the success of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and so forth. And one remembers that these were social gains that really accrued to African Americans in the South. And of course, Dr. King was leading the movement largely from the South. But by the time King came along, most Blacks were already living in big urban centers and outside of the rural South, where, segregation as it existed was more a matter of housing policy. It wasn't a matter of Jim Crow. Economic disparities were, far more pronounced and maybe germane to their concerns. And so when King died, of course, he died in the midst of trying to lead this poor people's campaign to sort of remedy economic inequality in America. He was killed. You have the advent of...
And people forget that the the full name of the March on Washington was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. And
Right.
we do forget that. Dr. King is killed.
As well as in his final book, the whole second chapter is a long critique of the Black Power movement for not focusing enough on class. And he recommended that they change their name to Power for Poor People as opposed to Black Power.
That's a very relevant point that I think will probably that I think we can probably pull forward to maybe where you and I come down in some of our critiques of Kennedy and some other folks. But just to sort of play out the story a bit further, yes, you have this major part of the Black community that sort of integrates into suburban America, mainstream institutions, college campuses, corporations, into the middle class. But then, as William Julius Wilson writes about, you've got this desperately impoverished Black underclass, right, which can't integrate into those institutions, which sees manufacturing jobs go overseas, and in places like at least LA and whatnot, sort of insourcing of immigrant labor, dislodging them from the agricultural economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that becomes the large segment of, Black America that winds up being impacted by, first heroin, then the crack cocaine epidemic, the rise of the Bloods and Crips, mass incarceration, and, taking us to the, the riots in the early 90s and a sweep of violence from about 1980 to 1995 or so that's been matched by nothing until, I guess, very recently we've started to see an uptick again. But across that whole arc of American experience, I sometimes ask people, like, for that disproportionately large segment of the Black community that you can, politically correctly or incorrectly refer to as sort of this Black underclass, and it's millions and millions of people, right? When does the American dream ever show up? And when I think about it in that way, even if I think that the practical policy-focused response of, Black Lives Matter and many other folks, defund the police, et cetera, was not only sort of, not well thought through, but, wildly counterproductive to the actual interests of the very people that movement sought to defend and uplift in many respects, the raw emotion of injustice, the sense that there's just something dramatically wrong with the way in which society is structured as it pertains to the interest and welfare of at least very, very many African Americans. That's something I feel a bit, especially the more I look at certain things. And so I guess I put the question to you, Coleman. Am I going a little bit soft? Am I selling out a little bit, or am I, or is there a degree to which, there's a larger story here that maybe some of us sometimes tend to miss as we celebrate the progress of America from King to Barack Obama and Oprah Winfrey, and this larger reality of an American experience that's been very good to you.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say is, no, you haven't gone soft. It's important to empathize with the raw emotion that people feel when they see the wealth disparity between the rich and the poor in this country, and the racial dimension of that disparity between Blacks and whites. And I as well, I totally get why people see this and immediately feel that the sort of woke diagnosis of the country as fundamentally racist is spot on, and that the woke policy prescriptions, such as reparations and so forth, are the path forward. I get that. It's a very powerful emotional appeal. One thing I would say is, when you ask where's the American dream for these people, there is something circular about that analysis, because, as Black people and most immigrant groups as well, basically everyone started out with nothing.
Sure.
And many were able to rise, right? And once they rise and achieve the American dream, well, then the people left behind are by definition the ones that haven't. But the ones that rose, many of them didn't necessarily have more inherent advantages than those who didn't. And it's a complicated problem, but I think it remains the case that America is perhaps the number one, certainly in the top 5 destinations for the Black and brown migrants of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Either they're wrong about the opportunities they're getting, the Nigerian and Jamaican and Pakistani and Indian immigrants who come here, they're either wrong about the opportunities that are available for them, or they're not. And I think mostly they're not wrong.
Right.
And that's not to minimize the problems of intergenerational entrenched poverty in the Black community and white community as well. But it is to say we should be eager to find out what is going right in America such that the American dream was ever possible to begin with. Mm-hmm. Most places in the world have not had an analogous dream. Right.
There's no French dream.
There's no French dream. Yeah. I mean, and part of the reason for that is because
I was about to make a bad joke about except maybe drinking wine and eating baguettes.
Eating cheese, eating lots of cheese.
I would need to apologize for that later. So.
French dream is drinking lots of wine, eating lots of cheese, and somehow never gaining weight.
Yes, there you go. Right.
But most countries, including most European countries, most Asian countries, have been organized around an ethnic group that all speak the same language, all have an identifiable shared look, an ethnicity and culture. And the country has simply been a fence around an ethnicity. Mm-hmm. America has tried to do something different, which no place in the world really tried to do before it, which is to be a country not based around a single ethnicity, but based around an idea.
Yeah,
which is the idea of the Constitution and the founding fathers and so forth, to be a democracy. And it took a long time and we are increasingly approximating what that goal is, but it has been remarkably successful insofar as the people of the world of all colors have wanted to come here and been able to come here and have been able to move from poverty to affluence to such a degree we take for granted when a random person with nothing from Southeast Asia comes here and within a generation their child is at Harvard. Right. Somehow no one bats an eye at that. But that's an incredibly profound story that most countries and systems are not able to achieve. So we should also consider that.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely with respect to that master analysis of the character of American society and the reasons why people want to be here, of absolutely all colors. I know why people, sneeze at the description of America as meritocracy, at least on the left, because even taking, our racial history out of it, you can see how, wealthy people are able to get their kids in as legacy applicants to, top tier universities. Everything in life seems to be about social networking and who you know.
Nepotism.
Right, exactly. And we can point to sort of limitless, examples of people being elevated who didn't seem to totally believe it. And yet, I feel like the more you draw the experiment out over time, the more you see that folks who are willing to sort of work hard and apply themselves, all things being equal, which maybe they never quite are, but nevertheless, that there are perhaps fewer fundamental barriers to social mobility in the United States of America for people who are willing to sort of buckle down and work hard. Ian Rowe, our dear mutual friend, of course, will, talk about the importance of fatherhood and religion and education and entrepreneurialism, the sort of, formula of factors that allow you to statistically speaking, almost inevitably sort of move into the middle class. Larry Elder talks about sort of similar things. I think that all those things are true of American society in ways that, prove your point clearly. I think what's interesting for me to ponder, however, is I think that this way of understanding things shows that race as an absolutely determinative variable for where you land in American society is just woefully insufficient. It's almost not even really a starting point for understanding what leads to success or failure in American life.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I think that there's something meaningful to be said about the differing experience between a Nigerian immigrant coming to America who, maybe doesn't come over with a lot of money, but comes over with a sense of possibility, maybe pre-existing sort of academic or entrepreneurial education or success, who's not really sort of mired in or bogged down by the social history of circumstances in the United States and comes here, with a goal in mind. And if he encounters any prejudice or anything like that, it's something that he's not likely to think about too much because one doesn't have a great sense of the expectations of other people's racial sensitivities when you're going into a new country. You're coming to make a new life for yourself. You don't have sort of like, I don't think you're in a position to sort of say like, well, hey, other people should be looking at me this way or the other.
And also almost by definition, you're going from a place you want to be less to a place you want to be more.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
So it's almost inherently a positive framing on your experience because you're comparing it to something you're leaving on purpose.
Yeah, whatever the negatives are where you're showing up, you can always compare it to to the bad things you're leaving behind, right?
Right, which is not true if you're born here.
It's not true if you're born here. I think what's also true is that whether you're talking about somebody who's immigrating from another country to this country, who may have an accent and so forth, but isn't tied to this larger history, or somebody like me who grew up here, but grew up sort of thoroughly integrated into sort of mainstream social and institutional culture, there is a way in which we are living simply a very different Black psychological experience, put the material dimensions aside for a moment, than folks who exist within sort of this core of the African American lineage that's traveled these different epochs that I've mentioned. So I mean, again, you go back in time, there's a bit of an off-ramp for some African Americans, for many African Americans, let me not minimize it, coming out of the 60s, right? Where, you do sort of integrate into these institutions and there's this larger celebration of that as a cultural phenomenon in American life. But one thing I've noticed is that many Black people who are of sort of an anti-racist kind of bent, who might tend to sort of consciously or unconsciously echo the themes of, Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram X. Kendi and so forth. They'll talk about white people feeling uncomfortable around them by virtue of their being Black, whether it's in the classroom or the boardroom or walking down the street. And for a while, when I was growing up, I used to not get that because I didn't experience that. But then, one day I just I noticed some differences, that I don't quite have the same dialect necessarily. I mean, I can code switch. I grew up code switching. I was one of those kids, because I spent a lot of time in the hood growing up. I live in the hood now, South Los Angeles and whatnot. But my father was always adamant that I speak, quote, the King's English, right? That I speak like I was doing a telecast on the nightly news, right? I wasn't walking around baggy pants and so forth. I didn't have my hair braided or cornrowed until I was 16 or 17. And when I did notice that people looked at me a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And so it occurs to me that when people say Black, they don't just mean like the actual color of your skin, right? They're talking about things like dialect. They're talking about things like affect, things like body language, so on and so forth, And you put this brilliantly once. You made the point that, and hopefully I'm not retroactively putting words in your mouth, but I seem to recall you making the point that part of what critical theorists sort of catch on to, which has a ring of truth to it, is this reality that while on the one hand we might be tempted to think that institutional culture is neutral, the truth is all spaces, including institutional spaces, have something of an accent, and that you don't always fit in with the accent that you bring with you. So from my vantage point, that's not a racial matter in principle, right? Because you can be any skin color. I am the skin color that I am. I am Black. I never feel uncomfortable in white spaces. I simply don't, But I grew up a certain way.
Right.
Whereas other Black folks, even if they are, very educated and so forth, might feel a different sort of friction. And so, in that sense, it gives me a little bit more perspective on how some folks, through no fault of their own, I think, may find themselves feeling like the spaces that are presented to them as being sort of neutral and universal and available to all Americans on the basis of merit and so forth are actually spaces that are somewhat rejecting of their identity. They might say humanity. And even if I think that's a dramatic term, they're feeling like they can't bring all of themselves into certain parts of American life as they exist now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering if that, one, seems true to you, and two, if it seems relevant to our understanding of the larger body of emotions surrounding our analysis of race in America.
It does seem true to me, and I'll give you a personal example. Is when I went from 5th to 6th grade, I went from the public school in my town I grew up in was like 30% Black, to a private school outside of town, which was, I think I was one of 4 Black kids in an entering class of 60. And by 9th grade, I was the only Black boy because the 2 others had left. So I went from like very, very normal place where it's very normal, unremarkable to be Black, to a place where like it's completely stood out to be Black. And I remember, the experience was going from one culture to another. It was very much a place with a different accent, the way that you say. Instead of calling it the principal, you call it the headmaster. I was like, I felt like I was in some kind of Harry Potter movie, and somehow other kids thought it was normal because maybe they had come from similar private schools, but I was very put off by the whole thing. It took me, I don't know how long, but it took me time to, it's like getting in a pool and it's too cold and it takes time to warm up and for you to feel like you really belong there. I remember that feeling distinctly. And as you say, in principle, it's not racial. I'm sure that there were white kids that felt the same way because this environment was as shocking to them. But in practice, I'm sure all the Black kids felt that way. Right. So it is natural for people to interpret it in a racial way. Although I'm not sure that I actually did at the time. I was a kid. Sometimes kids are less likely to make racial connections in that way, which I think is healthy, frankly. But yeah, I totally think that in a way, experiencing the discomfort at that age meant I don't experience it as an adult, which is not true of a lot of Black people. When Black people enter white spaces, a lot of them that aren't used to it, they are more likely to feel hostility. They're probably more likely to experience real and imagined hostility. And that is relevant. The one point I would make is it's also relevant to immigrant communities that come into the country, a new country, sometimes as adults, speaking accents, not even speaking the language fully. Whatever level of cultural distance exists between Black Americans and white Americans, I would say probably more cultural distance exists between your average immigrant to the country. And so in that way, I don't think that we can say this is the barrier. This is going to be a barrier that's going to stop us. I think we have to understand that is there, and institutions should be aware of that and try to have some more consideration for people who feel at odds with the environment a little bit. But I would hate for anyone to use that as an excuse for failure.
Well, I agree with you again entirely on that point. But let me say a little something about the barriers there in relation to that point, because I think what I see with respect to sort of this experience of what we're calling the Black experience, again, for so many folks, is that there is actually sort of a cross-class phenomenon, or at least maybe I should say continuum of experiences in much of the Black community, which sort of links in a narrative thread the sort of cultural frictional issues that we're talking about here to the real material deprivation that I think it's fair to say, even if I myself would not say that it is deliberately sort of like racially reinforced, but nevertheless is structurally reinforced for sort of this underclass of Black Americans. And so this is what I mean. I think that you've got, to put it simply, a lot of Black folks, maybe middle class, have a reasonable amount of education, but who are, coming out of Black communities who, may dress a certain way, talk a certain way, and just have a certain sort of social and cultural orientation, feeling themselves not completely at home in white America, to put it bluntly, or in mainstream America, let's say. I would say that that's something of a first world problem, which doesn't mean it's not a problem. It is a problem. But I think that what makes it significant in the context of the larger narrative is that you can tie that to this sort of structural reality wherein you have this Black underclass that, again, has gone from slavery to mass incarceration, Rodney King, on to George Floyd and so forth, for many really without great relief. I mean, there's a way in which I would argue life really was worse for many African Americans in the 70s and 80s and at least up to mid 90s than it was in the 60s and 50s. And, there's different reasons for that. Some of this mass incarceration, the drug epidemic, the gang violence, a lot of it was that. I also sympathize as someone who's more conservative himself with sort of the, bit of the indictment of the welfare state and culture of sort of politically motivated dependency that was sort of foisted upon the Black community. And I'm always a little bit curious to get your take on that piece. But I think that what happens is that sort of the continuum of experiences there, where on the one hand, even privileged Black folks feel kind of like socially, somewhat alienated, all the way to sort of this multi-generational cohort of African Americans who are just entrenched in poverty, in violence, and in failing, schools and community institutions, et cetera. That sort of allows many folks to say, well, look, the whole picture is racist because I can point to it for sort of this big mass of Black people who are poor, and I can point to it for Black people who, on the face of it, have succeeded, but who are never really going to be looked at as equals in white America. Now, again, like it's not exactly my analysis, and it's also not my experience in terms of my own personal day-to-day life. But I feel like many of us miss that whole picture in terms of why the BLM narrative is persuasive, if that makes some sense.
To me, it feels less rational than the gloss that you are giving it. Like I think that tribalism is a deep instinct, and that tribalism becomes easier when there is a skin color difference between groups. So I think historically, many immigrant groups have faced vicious discrimination in this country, from the Irish to the Italians, and you can go back and look at the "No Irish Need Apply" signs and all of that if you doubt or are unaware of the depth of prejudice against those groups. The one difference, besides slavery, in some sense, the equally important difference is that Black people are Black.
Yeah.
And the ease of discriminating and the difficulty of actually integrating populations through intermarriage and that has made the Black-white distinction much more hard and durable over time than the Irish, English, Italian distinctions. Those have become more blended, I think, over time, and therefore less important as social realities, because you can't necessarily look at someone anymore and pick them apart as a white ethnicity. And this is one thing that Frederick Douglass was wrong about. He thought that by now, Black people and white people would fully have intermarried and intermixed so that everyone would be just kind of a pleasant shade of light brown and nobody would care.
Everybody would look like me? Was that the idea, me or you?
Yeah. And as brilliant as he was, that was one of the major things that he got wrong.
Yeah.
He underestimated the durability and importance of just having a different look in maintaining separate, to some degree segregated communities over a very long expanse of time. And so that tribalism, I think, for Black Americans becomes easier because we look identifiably different.
Mm.
And racism also becomes easier going in both directions because we look identifiably different. And I think that it is mostly a deep kind of need hardwired into us by evolution, essentially, that we perpetuate generation after generation by the way in which we talk about race.
Mm-hmm.
So this shared story that you're talking about, which unites, Barack Obama with the poorest Black kid growing up in the hood.
Right.
That's the story we tell is a matter of our choice.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a pre-scripted narrative that just exists out there as a fact. I think we are continually shaping what that story is by how we talk about race and the history of the United States. To the extent we talk about it as merely a history of Black people suffering at the hands of white people and being thwarted at every turn and being unable to move past barriers that are set up for us, I think we create a more self-fulfilling prophecy, as opposed to a narrative of uplift and a narrative which acknowledges the injustices while focusing on how far we have come and how far we can still go.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I do want to make a point to sort of challenge you to recognize a contextual distinction in a philosophical kind of frame.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I mean. I think that when we say that it is our choice whether or not we want to remain locked in this inherited narrative or sort of expand our capacity for appreciating the nuances of reality such that we're able to see how it is we can actually progress towards the lives we want to live in spite of the history that comes behind us. I fully agree with you. But I think that sometimes, I think that actually almost all the time, when we have these conversations, we can sort of fail to appreciate human beings as operating in sort of, one of two psychological modes at any given moment when we're analyzing a social reality. On the one hand, there's kind of the frame of personal agency, which says that I have the power to change how I think about things so as to overcome them. And that is rational and true and empowering. And it's where I focus, sort of my sympathetic energies in terms of what I want to see. This is why I'm a big fan of, not just yours, but, Bob Woods and so many of our mutual friends. On the other hand, I think that recognizing that human beings have that capacity as a matter of kind of like, in the right circumstances, flipping that switch in their mind to allow them to excel, it's just sort of, it can at least be something that also exists alongside a lack of appreciation of the fact that human beings on some level, especially when you start to look at them at scale, we really do exist in a causal chain of events, right? Material, you flick one domino, it hits the others, they fall. That's a material sort of causal chain. But psychology isn't really any different, I would argue.
Yeah.
You take the particular experience of this group of people in this country, you go through that whole history I laid out. It only makes sense that the grievances that people feel would be as powerful as they are, and that people would feel trapped in that reality. Now, there are different ways in which you can show people another way of looking at things. I think that on the lazy level of superficial politics, and I'm not at all accusing you of this. I mean, you and I actually, work with and support groups that are on the ground showing people another way to live and another way to sort of see things. But as an indictment of our broader political culture, there's a way in which, many, many people, many, many influential commentators are content to sort of say like, hey, Barack Obama did it, Oprah Winfrey did it, Michael Jordan did it. Why can't you do it too? Your whole worldview is irrational on the basis of, these anecdotes of success or these exceptions or other patterns that we can point to. And I think what I'm saying is that for those of us who want to sort of open the psychological space for people to sort of transcend what they feel to be the limitations of their circumstances, I do think it's important to deeply empathize sort of with, people hate this term, the lived experience, life experience, personal experience, what have you, with the actual experience of people and the histories that they trail behind them, rather than doing what I see a lot of people, not yourself, but what I see a lot of people is doing, which is to say, let's dismiss everything that happened yesterday, whether explicitly or implicitly, because it doesn't matter. We should just be looking forward, I feel like that's actually a problem with the racial conversation. And it gives me a little bit of sympathy with folks who want to dwell on history a bit, with, people who pour their passion into the 1619 Project. Many of these, brilliant folks, whether I agree with them on everything or not, because I understand why they feel like that history needs to be more fully told. My criticism for them is that they then get locked in to a status quo of looking at things, which says that therefore nothing better is ever possible. But I do think a lot of times we go too far in the other direction by not fully empathizing and acknowledging some of the deeper currents in people's experience, both contemporaneously and historically, as a means of actually reaching them.
I struggle with this. I acknowledge you're pointing to a real paradox, which is that we are all the last domino in a chain of causation that stretches back to the Big Bang, even,
Yeah, right.
And we and none of us is the author of our own selves or our own impulses or our own life circumstances or our own genes.
Exactly.
At the same time, I don't know a single healthy, successful, happy person that operates in that frame of mind. Every happy, successful person I know acts as if they are the author of themselves.
Also true.
So this is just a straight up paradox. There is a truth that I acknowledge as a scientifically oriented person that at some level it's luck all the way down. It's genetic luck, it's environmental luck, it's your parents, the luck of your parents, the luck of your neighborhood, the luck of your schooling. On the other hand, if you go through life that way, you are harming yourself by dwelling on all of the short sticks that you drew, right? I think that's just a fact. And so I feel some sympathy with the people that want to maybe minimize is the wrong word, but really tell young people, no one is coming to save you. No one is coming to fix your past. No one is going to, you may not get closure about some things. You should try to understand yourself, and therapy can be a good tool. But beyond a certain basic level of acknowledging your own personal past and the ways in which you were victimized, going deep into the well of grievance is not a good strategy for becoming happy. I've never seen it work once. I've never seen someone that was miserable or depressed or unsuccessful or whatever And then after years of deep meditation about their past victimization and traumas, emerged out the other side of it a happy, successful person. What I have seen is people who were far too focused on the ways they've been victimized, and then eventually grew to pity themselves less, despite very real things in their past they could pity about, that grew to pity themselves less and ended up happy as a result. That I've seen over and over again. So how do I give people honest advice without lying about what I know to be true, which is the fact that we are all products of luck at some level.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, of course, you're making a powerful point, but you framed it as, I've never seen anybody dwell on their victimization and actually, sort of progress into a happy life. I do hear you on that. I do feel like, in some sense, now you can say that this is because they're capitalizing on the very grievance industry that, that they're reinforcing. You could make that argument, but I mean, and maybe he wasn't a happy man either, but I can jump to Dick Gregory or, or even Nicole Hannah-Jones or any number of other folks. So, and then, people who are not public intellectuals who are focused on this subject matter, but who do carry some of that chip on their shoulders with respect to sort of the larger, historical and, in their view, perhaps, unjust contemporary reality of American society, who still have made it incredibly far in government or business or any...
In a way, they're the Michael Jordans of the grievance industry, right? There's an upper crust of people that can be very successful by mining the grievances of the past deeply. That doesn't suggest that your average Joe, by going down that road and that mindset, both in their personal lives and with respect to their racial identity, is going to move forward as a result.
But I think that the counterpoint that I would put to that is, how easy is it for the average Joe to simply sort of, overcome, a sense of victimization in favor of agency in the first place? I mean, I agree with you that I see it all over the place. I see both of those things all over the place, but that's just because the sample size is so large, or the population is so large. You can find data points that stretch on endlessly in all directions, and yet those data points don't necessarily paint even most of the picture of what's actually going on. I think that, and there's so many other variables here that we tend not to talk about, like just the differences in individual psychology and so forth. You can have one person who's born into a group that generally has a certain dispositions. This person has another disposition, and they're more resilient to certain psychological traps, and they have more outgoing. They're more optimistic and so forth. And these are just factors that have nothing much to do with the circumstances that person was born into, but facilitates their adopting to them. But I think that the thing that I'm concerned about is, how do we most effectively, most empoweringly communicate with people at scale? Now this, interestingly enough, feels like a potentially reasonable place to segue into the conversation we were talking before about having on religion, and these sort of currents in society. Because I'll tell you where I put some hope, although I may also be merely revealing my own short-sighted biases. I tend to think that, and here I think I reveal myself to be maybe both to the left and to the right of you simultaneously in some sense. I tend to feel that there's a way in which what society has lost, even as we refer to anti-racism and John McWhorter's analysis as a religion and so on and so forth, is a narrative which, in a sense, equalizes human standing across the board by pointing out the fact that we are all fallen. We are all born in sin, right? And that whatever our advantages in a worldly or disadvantages in a worldly context are, there's this initial sort of project and struggle within the human breast to overcome our own intrinsic corruption, to be able to actually love each other well and treat each other well as a means of mutual uplift whereby we can actually become better tomorrow than we were, yesterday and today. And that this is the character of human existence, and that there's some undercurrent of perhaps divine benevolence that sort of creates a pathway towards that reality if we were willing to believe in it, and follow it. I feel like the power of that Christian narrative, and I think that there are other spiritual narratives which reinforce, similar themes, given the United States of America's historic relationship to Christianity and my own, I focus on that. But I feel like there is power in that should we find ourselves, reacquainted with it, perhaps presents a bit of a pathway whereby we can actually be inclined towards understanding and forgiveness to folks who, whether we fairly or unfairly, look at as either being the agents of our disadvantage or the beneficiaries of our disadvantage. I think that there is power in that point of view and in that narrative, which can point us towards reflecting on ourselves and how we can work within ourselves to make ourselves better people, as opposed to focusing all our energies or too much of our energies on condemning the structural sort of, inadequacies of society, but thinking nothing about how we comport ourselves. Sort of like, I'm, well and fair for me to go on and loot a store because of slavery and, institutional racism and so forth. That's a flippant example, but that, part of what we've lost in the modern age is that spiritual grounding in our relationship with the idea that we're all flawed, but that gives us something in common with the worst of us, right? That we can't therefore judge one another in personal terms, but we also are all capable of redemption. And so there's a basis for our believing in the goodness of one another and ourselves, right?
Yeah.
I feel like the absence of that is part of what makes it so difficult for us to find a path forward towards meaningful reconciliation.
So Christianity has declined in our society at the same time that wokeness has risen.
Yeah.
So you might ask, is that a coincidence? I don't think that it is, especially given how similar certain aspects of wokeness are to Christianity. Yeah. So consider the concept of original sin. We are born fallen and flawed inherently. There's nothing we can do about that. But we can follow the program of Jesus Christ, and so long as we do that sort of for the rest of our lives, we if not can be cured, then we can at least be treating our inner flaw, right? Even though we can never fully get rid of it. Very similar to the concept of white privilege. If you're white, you are born racist and with white privilege. This is what D'Angelo says. And you can't get rid of it ever. But if you follow the program of anti-racism, you can at least treat it. Right. And as Christopher Hitchens used to put it somewhat derisively, you were created sick and commanded to be well. Right.
Sure.
Clearly, there's something appealing about that sort of thing to the human psyche, or else original sin would not have been such a powerful concept for people. We all feel that we are kind of flawed and imperfect, and we hate certain aspects of ourselves. So it's nice to be told that God put that sickness there, and he knows it's there, and he has some thoughts about how you might address it, right? Interesting thing about wokeness is that it has original sin for white people, but it doesn't have original sin for Black people or people of color in general. In that sense, it really is, as a religion, it works best perhaps for white people because they have that original sin-shaped hole that can get filled by white privilege, but there's no analog for people of color or for Black people.
There's actually a reason for them to look within.
Yes.
In other words, right?
Yes.
Do the work, so to speak.
Yes. And they get that human experience through the religion of wokeness. But for people of color, there's no analog. There's no reason to look within. Right. There's only ever reason to point to society and say it's wrong. We are flawless, but society is flawed, essentially.
Right. Yeah.
Which is, and so Christianity is how useful in that it has that narrative for everybody, which I think makes it more appealing to me. Of course, I don't think it's true. And I'm not a religious person. I wasn't raised with any religion. I'm an atheist in that sense, but I think there are good aspects to religion, and that's one of them.
Yeah, indeed.
And people often like to forget that Martin Luther King was a Christian and that Christianity was one of the major pillars of his message. We like to, I think, frankly, secular liberals like to forget that aspect because it just doesn't resonate with us. We don't really hear it.
Yeah.
So we like to quote the other parts of him and forget that he was deeply Christian and that Christianity was not simply at least I would allege, it was not simply a language, a way of speaking for him. Right, it was really believed and a backbone of his project.
Yes. Well, and I'm glad that you said that. Maybe we can end on this point here, because even as I say Christianity, I say this very mindful of the fact that that's one term that means a million different things, but it's the Kingian sort of treatment of that, particularly in a social context, which I think is most reflective as a historical precedent, certainly any recent historical precedent, for what it is I'm trying to articulate here. Because, you could have a Christianity which is rooted in sheer conformity to dogma, right? It's like, let's just make sure that, let's make sure that you're in church every Sunday and that, you're not gay, or if you do, that you don't act on that impulse, and that, maybe you politicize it. You got to vote the right way. The candidate who's, seeking these policy outcomes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But King was about the transformational power, the socially transformative power of love as a spiritual force, which he saw as embodied in Christ's sacrifice on the cross, and also exemplified in Gandhi's, methodology and the Indian independence movement and so forth. And of course, Gandhi was not a Christian, but King referred to that power as Christian love, right? And that's what I'm getting at. I do think that, maybe one day you and I will have the opportunity to talk a bit about sort of the pure roots of, some of these issues, religion and, what is the character of reality? Do we or don't we live in an ordered universe? Is moral truth a mere subjective product of man's fancy, or is it reflected in something greater in the architecture of nature? But putting all of that aside, yes, fully embodying and exemplifying love and goodwill as an ethos that allows you to not be blind to structural circumstances in society and to the consequences of history, but at the same time roots you in an understanding of the fact that on some level, we are all equal because we are all flawed and have a moral obligation to ourselves as well as each other to love one another so that we might better love ourselves, right? That this sets the stage for our graduating towards what Dr. King referred to as the beloved community, right? And, I think whether you take it as literal or metaphorical, feel like part of why King still remains, even in an age where everybody else, even among historical figures, has been canceled and so forth, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but King, perhaps almost alone, even more than Lincoln, retains sort of a universal moral credibility. And maybe that doesn't last, but if it has lasted, and if it does last, I think it's because that movement wasn't just King, of course, did so much. You see it in the way we revere John Lewis. Did so much to embody that Christ-like way of being, And I think it gives people hope for the idea that you can live in an unjust society or an unequal society with perhaps an unjust history in many respects and still look forward to a positive reconciliation with folks with whom you find yourself at odds
right in
the present moment.
King used to say, in Christ there is neither Greek nor Jew, black nor white, bond nor free. And I struggle to think of any analogous claim a politician or leader can make today that would give people goosebumps while communicating the same message of common humanity. I can't think of one, right? So that was something he was able to say because there was a common Christian belief between black people and white people, and between white people in different parts of the country and so forth. And most of the things a politician might say today in that vein might ring hollow to people. Certainly younger people might ring hollow. What could they say? We're all American. We're all proud to be American. Well, I don't know. People have different feelings about that. Or what, we're all, there's only one race, the human race. Well, I think the University of California said that's a microaggression in 2015, right? So, and you can't really say in Christ there's neither bond nor free, because people aren't Christian anymore. I mean, people on the left aren't Christian, largely. So that wouldn't resonate in a bipartisan way. So we are, I think we have lost a language with which to talk about common humanity and what goes beneath the skin. And so consequently, we've seen people more open to the divisive and the tribal.
Well, that leaves us with some hard questions to answer in terms of how we move forward with the project to ultimately arrive at a greater reconciliation in American life. I am hopeful that somehow or other we can, but we'll have to leave some of those answers for the next conversation.
All right.
Coleman Hughes.
Thanks, Sean.
It's a pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Conversations with Coleman, guys. As always, thanks for watching, and feel free to tell me what you think by reviewing the podcast, commenting on social media, or sending me an email. To check out my other social media platforms, click the cards you see on screen, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.